Our son left us to marry a girl and never came back, not even when my wife was battling with cancer. Now that my wife is dead, he has come back, but with a different motive. I'm an old man, 72 years old to be exact. My wife, Elizabeth, passed away last week after battling cancer for 2 years. We were married for 48 years and loved each other deeply. I'm an old man, 72 years old to be exact. My wife, Elizabeth, passed away last week after battling cancer for 2 years. We were married for 48 years and loved each other deeply. Elizabeth was my rock, my best friend, and the love of my life. We had a good life together, living in the same big house we bought when we were newlyweds. It was always filled with laughter and love, especially when our son, Tom, was growing up. Tom was our only child, and we doted on him. We sent him to the best schools and supported all his dreams and ambitions. He was a good kid, always respectful and hardworking. When he went off to college, we were so proud. We thought he'd come back home after graduating, maybe find a job in the city and settle down nearby. They were so young, and Tom had just started his career. We offered to let them live with us until they got on their feet, but they declined. They wanted to make it on their own. At first, Tom called regularly. He'd tell us about his new job, their apartment, and their life together. But as time went on, the calls became less frequent. Weeks turned into months, and before we knew it, a whole year had passed without hearing from him. We tried calling, but he never picked up. We sent letters, but they went unanswered. It was like he had disappeared from our lives completely. Elizabeth and I were heartbroken. We couldn't understand why our son had cut us off. We wondered if we had done something wrong, if we had been bad parents somehow. The house felt emptier than ever. We missed the sound of Tom's laughter, the way he'd bound down the stairs in the morning, even the mess he'd leave in the kitchen after making a midnight snack. As the years went by, we learned to live with the silence. We focused on each other, on our hobbies, on our friends. We traveled a bit, saw some of the places we'd always dreamed of visiting. But there was always a Tom-shaped hole in our hearts. Every Christmas, every birthday, every milestone, we'd think of him and wonder how he was doing. When Elizabeth got sick, I hoped Tom would somehow find out and come home. I imagined him rushing through the door, full of apologies and worry. But he never came. After Elizabeth passed, I was lost. The house felt empty without her in it. I wandered from room to room, touching her things, remembering our life together. Planning her funeral was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I wanted it to be perfect, a fitting tribute to the amazing woman she was. The day of the funeral arrived. I stood at the front of the church, greeting people as they came in. And then, I saw him. Tom. He was older, of course, with touches of gray at his temples. Beside him was a woman I assumed was Anna, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. I froze, not knowing what to do or say. Tom approached me hesitantly. He looked nervous, his eyes red-rimmed like he'd been crying. We stared at each other for a moment, and then he hugged me. It was awkward at first, but then I felt myself relax into it. He broke down then, apologizing over and over for not being there, for cutting us off, for missing out on so much time. He said he had been young and stupid, caught up in proving he could make it on his own. He said Anna had encouraged him to reach out many times, but he had been too ashamed. When it was time for people to share memories of Elizabeth, Tom stood up. His voice shaking, he talked about how patient and kind Elizabeth had been, how she always made his favorite cookies when he was sad, how she taught him to ride a bike and bandaged his scraped knees. By the end, we were all in tears. My son was back. He hadn't forgotten us, hadn't stopped loving us. He had just lost his way for a while. I forgave him. How could I not? He was my son, and I loved him. We hugged again, and this time, it felt right. Natural, like no time had passed at all. Tom introduced me properly to Anna and the kids, my grandchildren. I couldn't believe it. The boy, Michael, was 8, and the girl, Emily, was 6. They were beautiful, and they called me Grandpa right away. It was surreal. We all went back to the house after the funeral. As the kids explored the big old place, running up and down the stairs and exclaiming over everything, Tom and I sat in the living room. We talked for hours, catching up on all the lost years. He told me about his job, his life, his struggles and triumphs. I told him about Elizabeth's illness, about our travels, about how we'd missed him. As the evening wore on, I finally asked Tom what his plans were. He hesitated, then told me he had a good job in another state, where he and his family had settled. They had a nice house, the kids were in good schools, and Anna had a career she loved. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was worried about me, about leaving me alone in this big house. But I knew what I had to do. I told him it was okay, that he should go back to his life. I said I was just happy to have him back in my life, and that we could visit each other. Tom protested at first. He suggested I sell the house and move closer to them. But I couldn't do that. This house was full of memories of Elizabeth, of our life together. It was my home. In the end, Tom agreed to go back. We made plans for regular visits and phone calls. As they were leaving, Tom hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you, Dad. I love you." After they left, I sat in Elizabeth's favorite chair and cried. I cried for all the lost years, for Elizabeth who didn't get to see this reconciliation, for the grandchildren we never knew we had. But I also cried from happiness. My family was whole again. Now, a week later, I'm wondering if I did the right thing. Should I have asked Tom to move back? Am I being selfish by staying in this house? But then I think of Tom's life, his career, his children's schools. I think of the life he's built for himself. And I know I made the right choice. Update. It's been 3 months since my last post, and a lot has changed. It's been a month since my last update, and I've made a difficult discovery about my son's true intentions. After much thought and consideration of the advice I received, I decided to test Tom to see if his renewed interest in my life was genuine or motivated by financial gain. I came up with a plan that I hoped would reveal Tom's true colors. I decided to tell him that I was ready to sell the house and move closer to him and his family. I thought this would give me a chance to observe his reaction and see how he'd handle the prospect of me actually becoming a more permanent part of his life. When Tom and his family arrived for their next weekend visit, I waited until after dinner to bring up the subject. The kids were playing in the living room, and Tom, Anna, and I were sitting around the kitchen table. I took a deep breath and told them I'd been thinking a lot about my future. I said that living alone in this big house was becoming too much for me to handle. I told them I missed having family around and that I'd decided to sell the house and move closer to them. The trust was broken, and I couldn't see how it could ever be repaired. I told him not to come back, not to call, not to contact me in any way. Then I watched as they drove away into the night. The house felt emptier than ever after they left. I spent the rest of the night sitting in Elizabeth's favorite chair, wondering how things had gone so wrong. I thought about all the happy memories we had made in this house, Elizabeth and me, and then with Tom as he grew up. It seemed impossible that it had come to this. In the days that followed, I went through a range of emotions. There was anger at Tom for his deception, and at myself for being so easily fooled. There was sadness at losing my son and grandchildren all over again. But mostly, there was a deep, aching loneliness. I considered calling Tom, trying to work things out, but every time I picked up the phone, I remembered what I had overheard and put it back down. I called my sister and a few close friends, explaining what had happened. Their support and understanding helped me through the darkest days. I started volunteering at a local community center, which gave me a sense of purpose and connection. I also made the decision to stay in my house. This was the home Elizabeth and I had built together, filled with a lifetime of memories. I wouldn't let Tom's actions taint that. I hired a part-time housekeeper to help with the upkeep, which made managing the place much easier. As the weeks passed, the pain began to lessen. I still had moments of sadness, especially when I thought about my grandchildren, but I also found myself appreciating the peace and independence of my life. Now, as I sit in our old house surrounded by memories of Elizabeth, I feel a sense of contentment. Life may not have turned out the way I expected, but I'm determined to make the most of the years I have left. And I'll do it on my own terms, with the knowledge that I stayed true to myself and to Elizabeth's memory.